G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and importantly a fantastic Friday leading into a great weekend as well. Now this video is being filmed a little bit earlier in the day because I'm about to jump in the car. I've got about 4.5 hours to go to make my grandfather's 90th birthday. So I'm really looking forward to that. And tomorrow there won't be an update, but I have a really great podcast / breakdown of what the changing oil prices really mean for Russia's ability to continue funding the war. And then are we leading to concession, and can they make that budget? How will it look? So I hope you're looking forward to that tomorrow. I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. Now, legends, as always, of course, we have a lot to go over. So we're going to look at the maps, we're going to compare maps, and I have geolocations to show you on where flags are going up and where changes are taking place, even if the maps don't actually show that. We have more confirmation about that Tu-22 M3 bomber that supposedly got destroyed yesterday. I'll show you that as well as some satellite imagery. I want to talk about how we are seeing priorities shifting as far as with America's trade war on China and that, of course, being reciprocated backwards, that priorities of where the ending to the war in Ukraine may be is shifting, and how that may shift as we have more of an economic decline or just more volatility in the market. And we need to talk a little bit at length because I spoke about it yesterday, but I want to go over it more because it's just being tweeted out about Chinese citizens fighting for Russia in Ukraine and how this is getting blown out of proportion, why this is getting blown out of proportion, and this misunderstanding of how China fight war that I think so many are just drinking the Kool-Aid of, that China would fight like us, and it's not making sense when you see then their actions taking place. So where we're going to start is with a Zelensky tweet. This is always something we look forward to. We continue to investigate all the circumstances surrounding the involvement of Chinese citizens in the Russian occupation forces. They're looking into these two, at least I've seen visually confirmed, POWs. It's crystal clear these are not isolated cases, but rather systemic Russian efforts, in particular on the territory and within the jurisdiction of China, to recruit citizens of that country for the war. Everything necessary must be done to ensure Russia has no such and similar opportunities to prolong and expand the war. So saying that Russia is the one wanting to then lengthen the war, which I agree with, but also expand the war, I vehemently disagree with that. It is definitely in Ukraine's favour to expand that war because the alliances to the West are much stronger than Russia's alliances then in China. But Ukraine, we know they systemically have recruited veterans of NATO countries to come and fight. There was ads about it, there was extra money, there was visas and visa extensions given, all of that. And people en masse, they didn't claim that the US, the UK and Australia were fighting at the front. It was volunteers, sometimes in completely Western units made up of volunteers. It was just seen as voluntary fighting forces. It's also super convenient that as your largest supporter, the US, launches a trade war against China, and as your relationship with the US has been on the rocks, now China has entered a war in Europe. I'm not suggesting that Chinese men haven't gone and fought for Russia, but a claimed 100 to 150, if we even take that claim, of the 1.4 billion Chinese, with the Russian forces sitting well over 1 million, it's as rare as bloggers admitting when they were incorrect. It's not systemic in that. And there's no real evidence of Russia systemically trying to recruit Chinese specifically. So we have one Chinese citizen that we know was killed fighting for Ukraine and two visually confirmed fighting for Russia. And I've given then the percentage here of the Chinese population that have gone and fought in this conflict. It's not exactly what I would call systemic. Let's go a little bit deeper in this and how China fights. So this is Piang Cheng-lang, and he, of course, was a volunteer soldier from Yunnan who served in the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. Sadly, he was killed, but you can see that we are seeing this happen on both sides of the aisle. And China has pushed back at this from Beijing's foreign ministry, and they have told relevant parties to refrain from expressing irresponsible remarks, pushing at Zelensky of don't make these irresponsible remarks about what is actually happening. We would advise the relevant parties to recognise China's role correctly and clear-handedly. This comes from Lin Jian. China has portrayed itself as a neutral party in the grinding 3-year war, despite criticism of Western governments with close ties to Russia and crucial economic and diplomatic support. But realistically, where China is sitting, where their power could influence things, really, they have been fairly neutral. They put forward the 6-point peace plan. Yes, it didn't take into account territorial integrity, but it did take into account many other things. They have been fairly neutral. Now, you may go they are on the Russian side of neutral, but imagine if they were on the full other side. Russia's industry would have zero issues pumping out 1,000 tanks a month if that was the case. Zelensky had earlier accused Russia of dragging China into this war, and this post that I showed you was actually after this as well, so after that warning from the Chinese. Kremlin spokesman Peskov said Zelensky was wrong to suggest that Russia was dragging China into the Ukraine conflict. He told reporters, partner, friend and comrade, China has always taken a very balanced position, so Zelensky is wrong. Lin from the Chinese Foreign Ministry has said China has always required that its nationals avoid involving themselves in armed conflicts in any form. China is not the creator or any party to the Ukraine crisis. We are staunch supporters of active promoters of peaceful resolution. And there is a lot of misunderstanding just about where China sits strategically, tactically, and how they fight more holistically as well. And this isn't just in direct conflict. This is also economically, as we are seeing with the US now. So I just want to run over this. And this was a slide from a recent video. You wouldn't have seen it. It got very little views, but I think it laid out some very important bits and pieces. And I'll link that below if you'd like to see. So we have to lay out some ancient philosophy that still influences Beijing's decisions today. So the first one we're going to look at is Thankyou, or in English, all under heaven. That China is the rule. It's not the exception. And with this outlook, it gives China massive amounts of strategic patience. That China, it doesn't see itself as rising. It sees itself as returning to its rightful position at the center of global order. This is why Beijing often avoids direct conflict, instead expanding influence through soft power, economic leverage, and infrastructure diplomacy, from Belt and Road Initiative, technology, AI, industry, all of these. Then we need to introduce as well yi yi ji yi, or the term in English is basically using barbarians to control barbarians, or fighting barbarians with barbarians. And what we see in this is China with not the alliances that many other countries think that they may even have, or friendships with China, of what benefits China. China puts China first, absolutely, because it sees itself under Thankyou as all under heaven. Now, we'll go into a little bit more of this, but this is why I believe that Putin and the West, they massively overestimate the Russian-Chinese relationship. We saw in the newest US threat assessment for 2025, my main criticism is that the US has overestimated the actual Russian and Chinese relationship. Even when both these countries were communist, they did not see eye to eye, and that's putting it very likely. The relationship is transactional, and at the moment maybe on the idea of anti-West, then expansion of West and this axis of upheaval. But if Russia doesn't start working for China, you'll see that it's not foundational relationship in decades or centuries. We've seen that this transactional approach was formed between the Nixon and Kissinger and Mao Zedong back in then the late 20th century, that it lasts as long as it benefits both parties. This was the US making contact during the Cold War with China. Again, we need to touch on that great states do not have permanent friends or enemies. They have strategic interests, and they only have strategic interests. Europe is learning this the hard way from the US at the moment, so is Australia, and I believe that Russia could potentially learn it the hard way from China as well. This is why we see China at the moment making decisions or are in talks about deals with tariffed nations for increased trade that will then affect the US tariffs. It's not that they want to do this. It's just, okay, what puts China as then Tianza all under heaven as the center of this? What benefits us? And in this, how can we then pull down on the US? And this idea, this yi of barbarians to control barbarians, I think is how China ultimately in Beijing see the war in Ukraine. As Russia is reducing their combat potential, and so is NATO, and we haven't at all. And a lot of this comes into how countries can fight too, and Wei Qi is a perfect example of this, where in the West and a lot of our military thinking is very Clausewitzian, very chess related, where you focus on the center of gravity, then to a decisive battle and winning. Where Wei Qi, you have strategic encirclements and you move into empty spaces and you then gradually mitigate the strategic potential of your opponent. And unlike chess, Wei Qi is very, very unclear of who actually has won the game until the very, very end. And another example of this is chess is about total victory. You'd want to get into then a position where you checkmate your opponent, where Wei Qi is about protracted campaign. The player seeks to then have relative advantage and win strategically over a much longer, more unclear period. So I think that lays out the next bit we need to talk about then priorities between the US, Ukraine, and Europe, as well as where China and Russia may be sitting. So we're going to take a bit of a step back. We have seen a marked decrease in America's focus on ending the war in Ukraine, where daily we had tweets or comments. We don't get that as much. And this is not surprising. There's only so much bandwidth a government can dedicate to one topic. And overall, what we're seeing is other things come to the forefront. Trump and Xi, they are now entangled in a full-scale trade war, 125% tariffs. And unlike Ukraine, this conflict has the potential to reshape global alliances and plunge major economies into recession. This will have much more effect on America than the outcome in Ukraine. The notion that Ukraine's territorial ambitions remain high on Trump's priority is a fallacy. I'm sure they're up there, but they're not 1 and 2 at the moment with this trade war going on. And that focus, I believe, is slipping very quickly. What does matter to Trump right now is securing mineral rights, specifically that Ukraine-US critical minerals deal, because this serves as a strategic hedge against rare earths that are dominated by China and Russia, both of whom are under heavy sanctions and tariffs and increasing. For example, China's recent export restrictions on gallium and germanium, which are key to semiconductors, along with Russia's tightening grip on titanium and palladium, have sent warning shots across Western supply chains. As I've said before, whenever negotiations begin in Ukraine, they must move swiftly. And what I'll say is negotiations have started. Yeah, we haven't seen Ukraine, Russia, and America in the room, but we have seen America having meetings with Ukraine, meetings with America. With Russia, therefore they have begun. But Trump is now waging an economic war with far greater consequences, and consequences that are far more immediate. They're not political or theatrical. They are immediate consequences affecting everyday Americans. And Ukraine risks becoming an afterthought in a much bigger game. We need to move on to Europe. I think we're seeing a similar pattern to begin to unfold in Europe. The longer this war goes on, the more war-weary European populations will become. In the European Union's what I would call pseudo-democratic systems after the past couple of years, where public sentiment in these pseudo-democracies can quickly sway policy. This fatigue has real consequences. Politicians will inevitably begin to shift attention and funding towards domestic concerns to maintain popularity, especially under that pressure that the US and China are exerting worldwide at the moment. So far, the economic blowback, particularly in energy from Russia, has been felt, but it hasn't been overwhelming. Of course, this could change soon as the US has now turned its tariffs towards friendly countries in Europe. And that Europe is so far not willing to work with China to play ball on all aspects of trade cooperation. If a global recession hits or governments start tightening public spending, priorities will shift inward and the priority of funding Ukraine will lower down the list. The tens into the hundreds of billions of dollars more that Ukraine would need to continue this war and even rebuilding will slip further and further down that list as economies become more stressed. And this is why I've said it makes complete sense for Putin to continue dragging out that war. And I'm not surprised to see this at all. The worse things get, the more tempting Putin's discounted oil will look to many nations in the EU, especially with US exports slowing and Europe grappling with an energy security in real time. Let's go on to then China and Russia. As we discussed yesterday, slowing global economies, fear of recession, with this comes a reduced demand for resources. In Russia's case, oil. Oil remains Russia's single most critical export and is a key pillar in its budget. And what we're focusing on here is Russia's increased defense spending as a massive part of its budget and where it needs that Urals crude oil price. Now, public sentiment in more authoritarian states, it doesn't shift policy immediately, but it is a myth to think that these regimes can ignore the will of the people entirely. They can fall very quickly if legitimacy erodes. There is still significant power competition in the upper echelons of these leaderships. Don't underestimate the will of the people from democracy all the way through to your authoritarian states. Now, much of Trump's rhetoric towards Russia has been aimed at pulling Moscow back into some level of Western US sphere of influence, and by doing this, trying to then prevent them from having deepening economic and military ties with China. Because Trump sees that China is a far bigger threat than Russia, and that is completely correct too. These sanctions, though, combined with the tariffs, could end up doing the opposite. So far, the sanctions have given China access to discounted Russian energy, while providing Russia with a reliable buyer of this so it can continue to bankroll its war. A recession in Russia is likely if we see the oil on its continued downwards trajectory, and the Kremlin, they may have to redirect funds to cool its overheated economy at the moment. But a total collapse remains unlikely, and the partnership, as long as it is still benefiting China, will then remain. The last thing that China want to do is get into a direct confrontation. That doesn't make sense, nor does it trend with China's historical ambitions and conflicts also. So this oversimplification, of course, makes it seem either more dangerous or less dangerous than it actually is. And with China's history, with China's strategy, this is why I think in protracted conflict over potentially even separate administrations over years and years and years is a very, very powerful player. And it is the case, it's the reason we've ended up in the case that we are in today, that it has been ignored over many, many different administrations. And then when someone puts the brakes on and goes, hang on, how much power have they got now? What is the global hegemony? What is the global balance at the moment? It then has a global impact then instantly. So let's look at this Tu-22 that Syrskyi claimed a Ukrainian drone destroyed yesterday, and Fighter Bomber has called this out and made a fair bit of fun of this claim around this being destroyed, and people even saying that now it's a more strategically important Tu-160. He pokes a bit of fun at the hundreds of virtually destroyed Su-34s last year, and that no, this wasn't destroyed. What you've tried to do is you've taken a satellite image of a drawn-on plane on then the apron of a runway and tried to pay that off, and this is the image doing the rounds. And what we can see and what we know is that Russia has painted airframes on parts of then Air Force bases too. And you can see this painted on here with just a pile of debris. Now, you can't say what this is, but there's not enough there for it to be that aircraft, nor is it going to be in a corner here. So, yeah, no, it from what we're seeing at the moment, unless something more comes out, remember, our bar for lost aircraft is very high because of, he rightfully points it out here, we have a boy who cries wolf syndrome of the hundreds of virtually destroyed Su-34s. So this at the moment is a painting that has some debris sitting on top of it. There's no actual evidence there. And if we don't get evidence in the next couple of days, I'm paying off that actually occurred. I think Ukraine need to be very, very careful with their propaganda. As we have seen, the credibility and legitimacy of belief in claims has fallen out the arse over the past few years, from people believing that a can of bloody potatoes, or it was, took down a fighter jet to a bloke with a shotgun, to now the bar's set incredibly high, and things like this just undermine that completely as well. Now, let's have a look at the maps. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, and the red check areas that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Now, the first place I want to come into is Kursk, Sumy. Now, no changes shown on this map today. We can step back to yesterday, today, then no changes. But we have a very important geolocation. Now, we have a lot of grey zone all the way to Basivki. We have other maps showing that this is occupied by Russia. But what we haven't seen is like geolocated footage of the Russians operating in Sumy. We only have maps. Well, today that has shifted. So we have up here in Zuravka, which is just to the west of Basivkia, right here outside of the grey zone, just before this turn, what we see is in this footage here released through Russian media channels, we have a geolocation of then a unit flag on top of this destroyed building here, as well as soldiers in then snow winter camouflage. So we can confirm that this is likely red, and it'd be very interesting to see if there's any red all the way through to Basivkia like is being claimed, because that is a very, very big change on this front and that movement across. Can Russia keep that momentum? I don't believe so. I don't believe they want to either. I think they just want to make, on the opposite side of the border here, that buffer zone. So let's look at then the Suryak map around Zurava today. And as you can see, this front line in here, this is where he is saying between Veselivka all the way through to Basivkia is in red. So wait out on that. I'd be very interested to see what we get in the coming days and weeks and months to what the real situation actually is in here. Now, remember, this was Zelensky and Syrsky's baby, and we know that intelligence is very, very tightly controlled, especially if it's going against the priority importance that was put on maintaining Kursk as well. So don't expect to see other than neutral or Russian maps or geolocations showing changes in here for how important that was seen and still is. Now, let's move down the maps a fair way, and we're going to come down to then the Alexandropol front. In my opinion, this isn't a new update because this is showing the same as Suryak has done for about a week. But if it is, it's a gain of about 3 kilometers. And this is what I've said, that this offensive, if it occurs, will be is like 3 kilometer, 2 kilometer advances, just grinding away at the front, because that reduces Ukraine's fighting potential more than if you try and push in one sector and have deep maneuver, which will be very costly in a drone war. I don't have an update in this direction today, but previous maps have shown this anyway. Let's then move into Toretsk. No change again shown on this map, but let's have a look here. Toretsk front, Russian army has secured the last 3 days of the 12th district of the city, including the northern suburb of Komsomol and the adjacent repair base, as well as the adjacent trenches. In addition, Russian forces recently launched a road assault over the St. Motrana on Moscow, or this mine, reaching the outskirts of this other area, and the assault was unsuccessful, at least on the last stretch. So the assault heading out was unsuccessful, but The majority of Tariffs has come back under the control of the Russian forces after a number of Ukrainian counterattacks in this direction. Also, we'll come west of here, Pokrovsk front, Uspanivka, some amount of this coming back under the control of the Russian forces. This Kotliny, Uspanivka, Pishani, this has been very liquid recently now that the Russian assault towards Pokrovsk or to get on the western flank has slowed and actually decreased in some areas. Also, we'll move our way back up the map. And what we saw within the last 2 weeks, because it's still seen as blue, is Nadia in here has been back under the control of the Ukrainian forces. Suryak is saying that now the Russian army has recaptured this locality here. You can see just the yellow in here. It's always difficult to see this, but not all the way. See this like funny Lego shaped like paddock in here that just through this sector, but Nadia apparently is back under control, or Jim's love in American Pie. Now we have one last update on this, and it's nothing spectacular, but we need to keep up with where grey zone shifts also. So to the west of Belatsky, you can see some grey zone shift, as well as towards Rozliv. Now, what this is telling me is more in line with what Suryak is saying, that the Belatsky out towards Shevchenko is getting occupied by the Russians, as well as this movement in the direction of Rozliv. This tells me realistically that this is going to look something like that, because the island boys in Rozliv have now then been adjoined. Remember, the island boys involved Chansk for like a month as well. Doesn't happen in warfare like this. If you are cut off, you have a very, very limited time just on water, just on ammo. Yes, things can be dropped by drones, but if you are actually surrounded there, you have a very, very limited time to be broken out or to break out yourselves. This isn't Call of Duty, but nor is it just lines on a map. These are still men who, of course, need water and food and ammo to survive in war as well. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.